Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I'm going to share with you all of the books that I read in the month of January. January was actually a relatively good reading month overall. I had some duds of books, and I had like a bunch of 5 stars as well, and even some 3 stars. So I just kind of was like all over the place in terms of things I loved or didn't love. But I finished 13 things during the month of January, which is a lot for me, but some of the things were really short. So, for example, I read like a short story, I read 2 novellas, I read like a few books that were under like 200 pages or around 200 pages. So, I had a lot of shorter works this month, which definitely helped me reach a number of 13. I think, according to Storygraph, I read over 3,000 pages. I can put the graphic up here of kind of like my overall month and how that looked. But overall, I would say it was a pretty good reading month. I just released a vlog where I read wintry books, and I think either 4 or 5 of the books in this video were discussed there. So I'm going to talk about those more briefly, and I'll link that winter vlog so that way you can go check that out if you want to hear more in-depth thoughts on any of those books. But I am going to divide this up into genres with one caveat that within the fantasy genre, I did read a book that I want to talk a little bit more in depth on, so that book is getting its own section. Okay, let's jump into classics first, because most of the books that I have here physically are actually the classics that I read this month. So the first thing that I completed was a Pushkin short story entitled The Blizzard. Sometimes it's also called The Snowstorm, depending on what translation you have. And this was at the beginning of my wintry vlog. I didn't really go into depth in my thoughts there either because it's only 10 pages long, and it's about these two people who want to get married, but their families don't approve, and they decide they're going to sneak out and marry each other anyway. But then a blizzard hits, and then the story just kind of goes from there. This was my first Pushkin short story. I've read one of his works of poetry, but this is like my first thing of prose of his that I've read, and I really, really enjoyed it. I liked it a lot, and I definitely want to read more from him. Another book that is in that vlog that I have mentioned, and I actually went so in depth in my thoughts on this one that it actually has its own spoiler section. That's Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton. This is my second Edith Wharton, and the other one that I read is The Age of Innocence, which I think tends to have more positive reviews than Ethan Frome, because the subject matter and some of the things that happen in Ethan Frome are things that produce a very visceral reaction in people, and rightfully so. So I went into this book kind of with some trepidation, thinking that I wasn't going to like it, but I really wanted to read it because it's very wintry. It's set in New England. And so because of those two reasons, I was like, oh, I really want to read it. It's actually specifically set in Western Massachusetts, which is where my husband is from. And so that really like kicked it up a notch for me wanting to read it during a snowy weekend in January. I'm surprised to say that I actually really, really enjoyed this book a lot. I keep thinking about it, and I think part of the reason I liked it more is because of kind of like the consequences and the tragic fallout that happens, which is possibly the reason why maybe people don't like it as much. I don't know. But I did feel like people's poor choices were not portrayed positively, and that makes a big difference for me when there's certain subject matters of things that I don't agree with. It makes it more palatable for me when it is also not being portrayed positively. So I'm not going to say too much more than that because it's only 100 pages long and because I talked about it in depth in my vlog. So yeah, I really liked it though, like a lot. I was shocked. Speaking of shorter works, short stories, I completed A Good Man Is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. This has 10 of her short stories in it, and according to the blurb on the front, this is the collection of short stories that established her as the master of the short stories. So this was something that kind of like made her more famous, I think, and more well-known and more renowned, and I can see why. I think it's an excellent collection of short stories, and I was trying to decide which ones were my favorite, and out of the 10 of them, I think I highlighted like 6 of them for ones that I really, really loved, but if I was forced to tell you my absolute favorites, I would say that it's probably The River, The Life You Save May Be Your Own, Good Country People, and The Displaced Person, but not necessarily in that order. That's just the order they appear in the table of contents. So I would say that those 4 are like my top tops of the entire collection. but I truly enjoyed like every single one of these. Flannery O'Connor does such a good job of examining human nature and its sinful tendencies and how that plays out in kind of like a brutal and at times like grotesque manner, but with humor thrown in. Some of her stories kind of end, many of them end in kind of like a horrifying way that examines sin. In particular, a lot of times she tackles hypocrisy and pride and racism, and all of those are present here. But overall, I just like her stories make me stare at the wall and be like, whoa, wow. Like they're very deep, but they are very brutal and sometimes difficult to read as a result of that. But she truly is the master of the short story, and that there's not a single word wasted. Like you can tell that there's purpose in every single word. There's no filler, and there's a lot of symbolism that I'm sure like goes right over my head because I am not like the best at literary analysis in terms of symbolism of like colors and this and certain things repeated. I don't always pay attention to those kinds of things, and I know that she goes really deep in those things. So her stories are just fascinating. They're even more fun if you can read them with someone else that you can discuss them with. For my British literature class, we read Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, and this is so tiny. I think it's like 40 pages, and this is so fun. These are just really silly, fun poems about cats. So I just absolutely enjoyed it so much, and I had so much fun like with my class talking about which cat they enjoyed the most, and like if they had cats at home, was their cat represented in these poems, and if so, which ones. And so it was just like really, really fun conversations. Apparently the musical Cats was actually based on this, which is really interesting. You wouldn't have thought that because these poems in general are not really interconnected, but I guess that most of the poems are like almost verbatim for the songs in Cats. I don't think I've seen Cats for like a really long time. I think I was like a teenager or a kid when I saw it, so I don't remember it all that well. I just remember it being super weird and not really having a desire to ever watch it again. But it did spur some of my students on to watch the musical, and they were quite surprised at how closely intertwined the poetry and the play were. With my Patreon, I read, not this entire thing, I read White Nights by Dostoevsky, which is one of his earlier novellas that he wrote before he went to Siberia. And we had a really great time discussing this. And yeah, it was just, it's a really interesting one because it feels very different than most of his other stories. It definitely doesn't have the philosophical and psychological depth that I've come to expect and enjoy from Dostoevsky. So it's definitely like not a favorite of mine, but I did really still enjoy it. I think it feels very lyrical and very dreamy in its writing because our narrator, our main character, is a man who is a self-proclaimed dreamer. And so he doesn't have a whole lot of interaction with the outside world. He's just content to kind of observe moving around him. And so it's really interesting, his perspective. And then he encounters a young woman and they meet every single night and talk and share their stories with one another. Thus the White Nights. It's the nights that they're meeting together. It's interesting because this short story actually had like a surgence on Book Talk. I think because it's more romantic than some of his other works. So maybe that fits the Book Talk vibe. I don't know. But I found it to be like really accessible, which is why I chose it as one of the options for our group read, because I know there are some people that are part of my Patreon that are interested in Russian literature, but they're intimidated. And it can be kind of like intimidating to start out, especially because some of them are absolute tomes. So I'm really glad that this one won. I think that it's a good entry and that, you know, it's not as intimidating. It was easy to read, but it definitely wasn't like one that I think will stick with me for a long time. For my in-person book club, we read Parnassus on Wheels by Christopher Morley, and every single one of us loved this book. It was such a great book to kick off our year of reading together. So if you've not heard of this is just a tiny little classic about a woman who is living with her brother, and she's kind of older, and she's just, you know, she has this person show up at her door who has this book selling cart that he takes from town to town and tries to sell books to people. And he's able to convince her to buy it and to go off on an adventure and a journey with this. And it's just like, it's so fun. It's so lighthearted. It is absolutely like a book for book lovers. And I don't have a negative thing to say about it. It was just so wonderful. And the last classic that I have on this list, I reread Anne of Green Gables this month. I reread it with my friend Stephanie because we plan to read through all of the Anne of Green Gables books this year together. But Chantel from Chantel Reads All Day actually is hosting a Year of Maud where she has a different Ella Montgomery book every single month, including the entirety of the Anne series, but she has some other books thrown in there as well. And so she so graciously invited me to be a part of her live show chatting about Anne of Green Gables. And that was so fun. I'll link that so you can watch it because we had a great time just talking about the book as a whole, talking about specific characters, and it was just a really wonderful time. This book is so nostalgic, and it's one of those books that like feels like coming home for me, and it's just like a hug in a book. Like, I loved it so much. Such a wonderful comfort read during a really, really gloomy month. I read one historical fiction. I say that questioningly because one of the fantasies I read is also set in a historical setting, but I think it's more fantasy than it is historical. So it's going to go in the fantasy section. But anyways, I read Jim the Boy by Toni Early. I read this for my Patreon because every month I do a vlog over there of a book that's been recommended to me by one of my patrons because they think I would enjoy it. And so I do a full spoilery vlog. And so I did that for Jim the Boy. And I really enjoyed this book. It's about a young boy named Jim. It begins on his 10th birthday and then ends on his 11th birthday. His father died about a week before he was born, and he lives on a farm with his mother and her 3 brothers. So he's got these 3 uncles who are doting on him, raising him, and his mother as well. And they live in a small town in North Carolina during the Great Depression. So there's a lot of changes that are coming to their small town because of just the changes that are happening in America. And you watch Jim just kind of come to a realization that the world is so much bigger than he is and so much bigger than his family or even his town. And so I thought it was really, really beautifully done. The prose itself is relatively simple for the most part, but then there will be like certain sentences that are just phrased so beautifully that just like stuck out to me. So it was a really enjoyable reading experience. It's very like cozy, very slice of life, and you'll have one section that's just kind of about like one day or one little event that happens or whatever. So to me, it felt pretty episodic, but I'm finding I really like country settings with like episodic things. Like, I loved My Antonia, I loved Dandelion Wine, and I would group Jim the Boy kind of in with that kind of same feel, although the writing's very different between all 3 of those books. Okay, moving on to like a fantasy sci-fi section. I read 4 fantasy books and 1 sci-fi. So I definitely read like almost as much of that as I did classics. So my month was like almost evenly divided. It's kind of weird. 2 of these books are ones that I talked about in my wintry vlog. So one of them is The Wood at Midwinter, which is a novella by Susanna Clarke. If you've been with my channel for, a couple of years, you know that last year Piranesi made it into my top books of the year, and the year before that Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell made it into my top books of the year. So I really love Susanna Clarke, and I was really excited when I saw that she was releasing a novella that was set in the same world as Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. However, I wouldn't even call this a novella. And like, it's more of a short story, but it has a ton of illustrations sprinkled throughout. And so it actually feels more like a picture book to me than it does even a short story. The illustrations are really, really beautiful, but the story itself felt really lackluster and bare bones for me. It has snatches of Susanna Clarke's beautiful writing that I really enjoy, but I felt like the story itself wasn't very fleshed out. And I know that it's a short story. I know that. But when she hasn't published anything in a while and you're like desperate for more from Susanna Clarke, it's really disappointing when this is what you get. The author's note actually is longer than the story itself in terms of word count. And I loved the author's note because she talks a lot about her inspiration. And she actually mentions two Borges short stories, The Library of Babel and The House of Assyrion, and how both of those influenced Piranesi and also the short story that she wrote. That was actually my favorite part of this. I did get it from the library, and I'm pleased that I got it from the library on ebook because I didn't have to pay for it, because full price, this book is like $18, which feels like such a ripoff to me, unfortunately. Like, it feels like this would have been a footnote in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which if you've read that, you know, there's lots of footnotes, and sometimes the footnotes are really long and have like a full story. That's what this felt like to me. So yeah, I was disappointed. The other book that I mentioned in that vlog, which again, I go into more depth, is The Fox Wife by Yangtze Chu. And this is a story that is heavily steeped in Chinese mythology and folklore, particularly the folklore surrounding fox gods. There's a K-drama that I love called Tale of the Nine-Tailed, which is about nine-tailed foxes in Korean mythology. So there's fox mythology and a lot of East Asian mythologies and stuff. So I was really excited to read this book. We alternate perspectives between a fox and then also an older gentleman who is an investigator. And so that's kind of how it goes. I felt like the mythology was really, really interesting, but I did feel like all of the reveals were so heavily foreshadowed that, like, when things were revealed, I was like, well, obviously, like, why is anyone surprised? Like, there was so much about it that was like really lackluster, and I found myself not very attached to the characters. The folklore was really what kept me going, and I felt like the writing itself was fairly decent, although I didn't like how she kept, like, every time she switched perspectives, she was also switching whether or not it was first or third person and whether or not it was past or present tense, even though the two perspectives are happening at the same time. I also read Caraval, which is like, everyone has probably read this that wanted to read it at this point. But I read it for We Love Jenny because it's one of Jenny's like favorite YA romantasy series. And I can see why. It feels very, very Jenny. So we follow these two sisters who end up on this island where there's like this high stakes, like, magical game. And if you win, you receive a wish from someone who's like a powerful magician, I guess. I don't know. Like, so the idea of it was really, really fun, and I really liked the high stake games elements. But obviously, it was very, very romantasy. Like, the romance was so heavy and kind of awkward at times, in my opinion. I didn't feel like it was like the best written, but also I don't feel like it was the worst written in that either. But I did find that there's a lot of description of this world because things look very different on this island, and it's kind of magical and like whimsical at times and like bright colors and stuff. But when there were descriptions of how things looked, it felt like a list of colors. It didn't feel like a really immersive description. And so that felt unfortunate to me. I had fun with it. I thought it was a fun book, but it wasn't life-changing. I think I gave it 3 stars. Like, it was fine. Like, it was fun. I'm not sorry that I read it, but I'm also not invested enough to continue on in the series, particularly because almost every single person I have talked to has told me that the series just gets like weaker and weaker as it progresses. I think the only person who I talked to that didn't feel that way was Jenny. I think she loved them all. The sci-fi that I read in the month of January was Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, which is the first of his Southern Reach trilogy. And my word, what a weird book, which I went in knowing that. And so Murphy Napier has talked about this book. It's like one of her favorite books of all time. Like, she loves the whole series, but she really, really loves book 1. So my friend Whitney bought the book because she thought it sounded interesting and she really likes weird books. And so she let me borrow it. And when I tell you, this book consumed me. It did. I couldn't believe it. I loved this book. Like, I stayed up till 1 a.m. to finish this book because I had to know like how it was going to resolve. And I can't remember the last time a book has done that. I think it's been years since I have stayed up late because I just had to know what was happening in a book. So this is a sci-fi, as I mentioned. And so it's kind of weird. Well, it's very weird. There are these people that go on expeditions to this place called Area X, and they go and they're sent to collect data and then bring that back. And there have been issues with previous expeditions, and that sometimes people return and they have lost all their memories, or they're completely insane, or sometimes people don't return at all. Either they completely disappear, or people on the expeditions like go crazy and kill each other. Like, the expeditions have historically not gone super well, but this area that they know nothing really about is kind of like pushing the boundaries, and the boundaries are pushing into their world, and they're trying to find out like why. So there's a lot of answers that you don't get in this book because there are future books, and I've already started book 2, but it's really, really interesting. We get a perspective from someone who's just referred to as the biologist, because the people who go on this expedition, they don't use their names because their purpose on this expedition is not their identity, but what they offer to the expedition, like their area of expertise. So that's kind of where we go, and like weird things are happening, and like it is so bizarre, but it sucked me in like so much. Like, oh my word, it was one of my favorite books that I read this month. Last but not least, but maybe least, I want to talk about Wind and Truth. And I could talk about this book at length, so I'm going to try to keep this semi-brief, but I am giving it its entire section because I think I have more to say about this than I do about some of the other books that I read this month, because I want to explain my thoughts on it because lots of people are talking about it. I thought about doing a full review for it, but I'm going to be honest and say, like, I don't feel like dealing with rabid Sanderson fans who are going to come for me in the comments, so it's not getting its own video, because I don't want just like a whole bunch of random people to watch it and be like, your opinion sucks, because I don't have a positive opinion of this book, unfortunately. So this is the final book of the first arc of the Stormlight Archive. If you know me, you know that I like Sanderson a lot and actually hosted a whole like Mistborn read along last year, although like I didn't love Mistborn quite as much the second time around, but I still really enjoyed the books. I enjoyed like where Sanderson was going with it. I enjoy how he sets up a book, and then at the end, like, it might be kind of slow, the build, but when you get to the end, there's what they call the Sanderland, where all the plot just culminates and you're like, holy cow, what did he just do? And it like blows my mind almost every single time. I actually really loved every single Stormlight Archive book, which is actually a really unpopular opinion because most people love the first 2, and then Oathbringer's like, okay. Oathbringer's my favorite in Stormlight Archive, which again, unpopular, but I love Dalinar, and that's Dalinar's book. And then most people felt like Rhythm of War was much weaker, and in hindsight, it's been almost a year since I've read Rhythm of War. In hindsight, I would agree that Rhythm of War is probably the weakest of the first 4 books, but I still gave it 5 stars because I was invested enough in the plot. I thought the Sanderlanche paid off. I really like Navani, and there's a lot of focus on Navani and Venli in that book, and a lot of focus on like science, and I thought that that was really interesting. So I really enjoyed it, even though I felt like it was a little bit more meandering, and there were like some different things, and it took a different turn than what I expected it would, but I still really liked it. I had several friends who finished Wind and Truth before I did, and they were really disappointed with it. So I went into Wind and Truth hearing people be disappointed by it. So I felt like I had lowered expectations going in. So I'm like, you know what? I might actually, maybe I'll actually like this book more, because a lot of times when I go in with lowered expectations, I'm like, okay, that wasn't so bad. That didn't happen here. My expectations were not low enough, unfortunately. I think I ended on around a 3-star for this. I could probably give it a 2.5, honestly, because I was just disappointed with so many things about it. First of all, I felt like we had so many plot points. Sanderson took just about everybody that we know and love and split them into different things that are happening. And so because of that, we are spread really thin during this book, and we even have some perspectives of people that like I just didn't care about. I wasn't invested in them or their plot. And even people that I really liked, I didn't like where they were. Like, I just wasn't interested. He goes like really in depth in a lot of different things, and I felt like he just over explained so many things and goes really deep into like lore dumps, essentially, which is fine because, you know, lore is great and lore is some of like the most interesting things in the Cosmere because his books are now becoming so interconnected. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that it made the book feel bloated and it made it drag. I think he would have been better served to kind of like release maybe a lore book separately. I also felt like in the past, all of the Stormlight Archive books have been very focused on mental health. And I don't think that that is a bad thing. There were times where I related to it, times where I didn't, but overall it felt like a lot of character growth happening with these mental health struggles. In this book, there's a lot of telling us about mental health struggles instead of showing how the characters are feeling and processing this. It's like an internal monologue that they're having with themselves a whole lot of the time. And as a result, it felt like really like heavy-handed in a way that didn't feel emotional to me at all because there was just a lot more telling than there was showing. And then there's also just, people have talked about how there's a lot of modern language in this book that just doesn't seem to fit. And I would agree with that as well, like that the word therapy and therapist is used over and over and over again. And that doesn't bother some people because it's introduced by Wit. So that part feels a little less weird, but it just feels like so on the nose. And because of characters that are taking up this mantle of therapy and therapist, they're main characters who we've rooted for with their mental health struggles in the past. And as a result of now them trying to be someone else's therapist, I'm being vague on purpose in case you don't want to be spoiled for that, that person who was more of a main character feels like a side character in this book, which makes their arc feel quite unsatisfying. Like I'm very happy with where that arc ended up, but I wasn't emotionally invested in the journey that it took them in this book to get there because they felt like a shell of themselves. And to be honest, most of the characters in this book did, because we're just focused on what they're doing rather than any sort of like character thing. I felt like it was very plot heavy more than it was character heavy, but the plots weren't even that good. They were spread so thin. I didn't hate everything about this book though, so that's why it's not like it's like a 1-star. And I recognize Sanderson's genius in some of this, but I did feel like the ending conclusion for some of these characters felt a little bit unsatisfying because this is an end of an arc, which is not the same as the end of an era. So I wasn't expecting the same amount of closure that you would get at the end of like one of the Mistborn trilogies or whatever for that reason, because those are the end of an era and then we jump forward hundreds of years in time for the next one. The next Stormlight Archive arc I think takes place like maybe 10 years in the future or something like that. So as a result, we're gonna see these characters again, so it's okay that we didn't get like full closure, but like the Sanderlanches at the end did not Sanderlanche for me for the most part. Like a lot of it either seemed really obvious or just like didn't make any sense and kind of felt like lazy story writing to me, where he would go into such depth on one thing and then there would be a plot twist where something happens that seems to break all of the rules that he laid down and there's no explanation for how that works. They're like, well, it just did. So it's just kind of disappointing in a lot of ways, but there were things I did really enjoy. Like I really liked Dalinar and Navani's journey throughout the entirety of this book. Shallan's journey I liked at the beginning and then I liked at the end. The middle section I was just kind of like, whatever. I liked being able to examine some Radiants who had different gifts that I hadn't been able to really picture or understand quite as well before, particularly Renarin in this book. Another thing that I keep seeing people bring up is like content in this book. I've seen videos where someone has actually described this book and talked about like the issue they had with the sexual content in this book, and I did not understand. Like people are talking about like, oh, Sanderson's got spice in this book. No, he really doesn't. I'm like, did we read the same book? Because like people are like, oh, it's like there's spice, and I'm like, there's not a single body part mentioned. It fades to black. Like it's really not that bad. Like I thought that Mistborn Era 2 had more content in that vein than this book did. And so I was really surprised when I saw people get like really upset about that. Like I watched multiple video reviews where people talked about that, and I was so surprised by that because I just like, it didn't even like register as much for me, like, because maybe it's because the last Sanderson thing I read was Mistborn Era 2. I don't know. Anyway, overall, I would say that Wind and Truth was really disappointing, and I feel like such a hater saying that because I love Sanderson and I don't want to nitpick it to death. I could have made a review where I nitpicked it to death, and I don't want to because there were things I enjoyed about it. I finished it. It was like over 1,300 pages long, and I finished it. But I just felt like there were things that were really unsatisfying. I forgot to mention, I loved Adolin's character arc in this, but I felt like a lot of the time we were with Adolin, I was quite bored because it felt like the same thing happening over and over and over again. But I really did like where he ended up, and I like Adolin as a character. It felt like so much of this book was set up for the next arc and for the Ghostblood series that Sanderson is about to write. But when this is supposed to be the end of the arc, why is most of this book set up for the next arc and almost no closure for this arc at all? And most of it's the setup for that and for Ghostbloods and for these other things. And I'm just kind of like, okay, this feels like a filler book, but it's supposed to be a conclusion in some ways at least. And so I think that's part of what disappointed me, is that I felt like we didn't really go anywhere with so much of this. All right, well, I'm going to stop here because I don't want to just keep going on and on. But those are the books that I read this month. I had some books that I really, really loved. I had some books that I was like, oh, it was okay. And then I had some books that I was quite disappointed with. And so I feel like I ran the whole gamut this month. Like anything from like a 2-star to a 5-star, it was there. Because I usually don't give 1 stars for books that I completed. Usually if I completed it, there was enough in it to interest me and keep me that it deserves a 2-star. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below if you've read any of the books that I mentioned here. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And also let me know what your favorite book was that you read in the month of January. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.